Hello everyone. In the last video, we looked at how to add statuses and create transitions between them to build a workflow structure. In this video, we're going to look at status and transition settings. I personally like to build the workflow structure first and then fine-tune the settings after. Before we get started, I want to point out this list at the top. All these forms were built from the same form type. Form types act as a container for the workflow. You'll notice that it says workflow will be updated for the following forms. So any changes we make to this workflow will reflect in all the forms listed. Let's start with the initialization settings. These are the settings from when we first open the form before we hit save. We can define which fields are accessible to the person initially creating this form. The properties that we have in the editable properties section will be available for input, and the ones in the disabled properties section will be grayed out. We can transfer these properties from one section to another by selecting the property and using the arrows. Let's jump to the actual form so we can see what this looks like. All section 1 fields are open and we can add the required information. As I scroll down, we can see the other sections have been grayed out so that whoever is initializing this form can only fill out section 1. Let's jump back to our set workflow screen. You probably already noticed this, but all my editable properties, which are defined by each control binding, have requester at the beginning. Let's jump to the design form page in case that didn't quite make sense. When I select a control, you can see that I've started the name of the binding with the section name. I did this to easily identify the properties from the list that I want editable from each step of the workflow. Also, here's the list of the default properties that come with each form. I'd recommend you leave these as editable too, unless you don't want a step in the workflow to have access to pin the map or model locations and so on. Next, we have the transition settings. This is set by the starting status, which we could have more than one if needed. For this form, we only have the one. From here, we can select certain roles or individuals to get an email notification on the transition. To add more, just hit the add button again. And to remove, select the trash can. Next, we have property assignments. From here, we can define who this needs to be assigned to on this transition. Set how many days after transitioning it will be due, or change a value of a certain property. Now that we have the initialized settings done, let's jump back to our form. Once we hit save, we are now in the first status of our workflow, addendum request. It gives us the option to request approval and transition this to the ops coordinator approval, the next status in the workflow. Before we do that, let's go back to our settings and make sure we have everything set up properly for the addendum request status. We have this set as the starting status and in the open state. We also have all our properties set. For statuses, we can select which roles are able to view the form while it's in this status. For this status, we will select all roles. Now, let's set up our transition settings. We have given our transition a name and defined how we want our statuses to evolve. Next, we have the option to include a comment or even make it mandatory. Do we want to notify the user on transition? If so, we can select the add button and add based on roles or individual team members. There's also this handy option to notify the creator as well. Permissions are set by capability. The capabilities a role has is set in the Set Permissions page. So based off the settings here, we'll determine who can use this transition. We will allow the assigned to person to transition regardless of their permissions. So we will check this box below, which will override the above settings. Last, we have the property assignment. We already looked at this setting when we set up the initialization settings. Since it's the operation coordinator that needs to approve, let's add them to the assign to option. We have everything set, so let's jump back to our form. We can request approval and start to move this through the workflow. Since we set the assign to Thomas Schimpf in the settings, it has already been populated. Now we can add a comment if we want and confirm. We can see that section 1 is now grayed out. We can now add information to section 2, while 3 and 4 are grayed out as well. Now we can go back to the set workflow page and complete the settings for the rest of our statuses and transitions. This wraps up the workflow status and transition settings. Thank you for watching.